Stay with us, sir. Keep breathing.
Pulse is thready. We need to move. IV is secure. Saturation dropping.
Push harder!
There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a man when the world he thought he understood begins to come apart. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of sleep, the silence of a person sitting completely still while everything they love rearranges itself into something they no longer recognize. That is the silence Daniel Hargrove was living in on a Tuesday night in late October, when he sat alone in the cab of his truck in the parking lot of a hardware store in Millbrook, Ohio, at 11:47 in the evening, holding a manila envelope he had not yet opened. The interior light had clicked off 10 minutes earlier. He had not moved to turn it back on. He just sat there in the dark, one hand resting on the steering wheel and one hand flat on the envelope, breathing slowly, the way a man breathes when he is trying very hard not to feel what he is about to feel. He was 54 years old. He had worked the same civil engineering job for 22 years. He had been married to the same woman for 18 of them. He had 2 daughters, a mortgage that was 14 months from being paid off, a yellow Labrador named Hank who slept at the foot of his bed, and a scar on his left side that curved from his lower ribs down toward his hip, a scar he had carried for 5 years. The physical mark left by the surgery that had saved his life. Not a surgery he had chosen or planned for. A surgery that had been made necessary by a night he could not fully remember, on a road he had driven more than 1,000 times, when a truck crossed the center line on Route 9 and struck his car with enough force to shatter his door, snap 2 of his ribs, and shut down both of his kidneys. The paramedics who pulled him from the wreckage that night told his wife, who was standing on the shoulder of Route 9 inches, her nightgown, and bare feet, that they needed to move quickly. His wife's name was Carol Ann Hargrove, born Carol Ann Whitfield, a woman who had built her entire adult life around the management of difficult things. She was a former hospital administrator. She was the person her family and friends called first when something fell apart, because she always answered and she always knew what to do. When the paramedics told her they needed to move fast, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She climbed into the back of the ambulance beside her husband, took his hand in both of hers, and told him in a voice so level it was almost frightening that he was going to be fine. He was not fine, not for a long time, but she was going to make sure of that herself. For 5 years, Daniel Hargrove believed that what happened on Route 9 was an accident. There was no reason not to believe it. The official police report said it was. The insurance company agreed. The driver of the truck, a man from southern Indiana who worked for a freight company out of Louisville, had a clean record, no criminal history, no known connection to Daniel or Carol or anyone in their lives. He had pled no contest to a traffic citation, paid a fine, and the case was administratively closed within 4 months of the crash. Daniel was an engineer by training and temperament, a man who trusted documented evidence and had little patience for speculation. He had filed the accident under the category of random catastrophe, the kind of senseless event that carries no meaning and no author, and he had moved forward, because that was what you did, and because he had a wife and 2 daughters and a body to rebuild, and there was no time to sit with questions that had no answers. He opened the envelope at 11:53 in the evening. He had been sitting in that parking lot for more than 40 minutes, and the October cold had started pressing through the glass, and Hank was at home waiting. And there was no more reason to delay the thing he had been delaying since the envelope arrived at his office 3 days earlier. He opened it the way you open something you know is going to change things, slowly, deliberately, the way a man opens a door when he cannot be certain what is standing on the other side. Inside was a single photograph, printed on standard copy paper, slightly enlarged and slightly pixelated, showing 2 people standing outside a roadside diner on a gray afternoon. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a name in blue ballpoint ink, printed in clean block letters. Daniel read the name. Then he picked up his phone and searched it, and the first result told him the man in the photograph worked in freight logistics, and the second result told him that the freight company this man had worked for had employed, among its drivers, the man who crossed the center line on Route 9. Most people will never have to choose between gratitude and the truth. Daniel Hargrove had no such luxury. Because what the photograph suggested, what the connection between those 2 names suggested, was the worst thing a person can be asked to consider about someone they love. That the accident was not random. That the sacrifice that followed it was not simply love. That the woman who had ridden in that ambulance with him who had given him a piece of her own body so that he could keep living, may have known something or done something that made the sacrifice necessary in the first place. He did not know yet if any of it was true. He did not know how deep the story ran, or who else was tangled inside it, or what it was going to cost him to follow it all the way to the end. But he knew, sitting in that dark parking lot with the photograph in his hand, that he could not put it back in the envelope and drive home and live as though he had never seen it. This is not a simple story. I want to be clear about that before we go any further, because simple stories have villains and heroes and a clean line between what is evil and what is good, and this story does not have any of those things in any clean form. What this story has is two people who loved each other for a long time, and a secret that lived between them like a stone wall, invisible from the outside, impossible to ignore from within. What this story has is a question that does not resolve neatly. Can a person commit an act of extraordinary generosity and an act of terrible betrayal, and have both of those things be entirely, completely true at the same time? That is the question at the center of everything you are about to hear. And I am going to ask you to hold it and not answer it too quickly, because the answer changes depending on which part of the story you are standing in. There are 3 questions I want you to carry with you through this story. The first is this: why would a woman who was willing to give her husband a kidney arranged to put him in danger in the first place? Because if what that photograph implied turned out to be true, then Carol Hargrove had done both of those things. She had contributed to the conditions that nearly killed her husband, and then she had saved his life with her own body. Those 2 facts cannot coexist comfortably. They cannot be reconciled without understanding something about what happened in the period before the crash, about what Carol knew, what she feared, and what she had been asked to do by someone she had not told her husband about. The first question is about motive, and motive, in this story, turns out to be far more complicated than it first appears. The second question is about the envelope itself. Someone sent that photograph to Daniel's office. Not to his home, to his office, which meant someone knew where he worked and chose that address deliberately, which meant the sending of it was not casual. It was intentional. It was timed. Someone wanted Daniel to see that photograph at this particular moment in his life, 5 years after the crash, 4 years after the kidney transplant. Why now? Why not sooner? Why not the day after the crash, when it might have changed the investigation? The envelope had no return address. The photograph had no note, no explanation, nothing except the name on the back. Whoever sent it wanted Daniel to find the connection himself. They wanted him to do the work. And that means the sender had their own reasons, their own agenda that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with something else entirely. The third question is the one that kept Daniel awake for the 3 days between receiving that envelope and opening it. And it is the question I want you to sit with for the rest of this story. If Carol was guilty, if she had played some role, however reluctant, however coerced, in what happened on Route 9, then what exactly was the kidney transplant? Was it love? Was it guilt? Was it an attempt to pay a debt she could never fully repay? Was it all of those things at once? And does the answer to that question change anything about the sacrifice itself? Because Carol's kidney was real. It was inside Daniel's body right now, doing the work that kept him alive, as he sat in that parking lot reading a name on the back of a photograph. Whatever else was true, that was also true. And Daniel Hargrove, an engineer who dealt in structural facts, did not know how to hold both of those realities in the same hands. Daniel Hargrove grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 sons born to a high school shop teacher and a woman who worked the front desk at a dental practice for 31 years. His father was quiet and exacting, a man who believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly the first time, and who expressed affection primarily through the teaching of skills, how to read a blueprint, how to replace a brake pad, how to build a bookshelf that would still be standing in 50 years. Daniel absorbed all of it. He was not a child who daydreamed or drifted. He was a child who wanted to understand how things were built and what made them hold. And he carried that disposition into adulthood and into his career and into his marriage. And for most of his life, it had served him well. He liked things that were structurally sound. He liked things that didn't shift without a reason. He had met Carol at a wedding in 2001. She was the maid of honor. He was a co-worker of the groom. They had been seated at the same table at the reception and had talked for 4 hours without either of them noticing that most of the other guests had already gone home. What struck him first was not her appearance but her intelligence, the way she organized a conversation, the way she listened without interrupting and then responded with something that showed she had actually heard what you said, rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. He asked for her number before the parking lot emptied out. She gave it to him without hesitation, which he would later say was one of the most attractive things she had ever done. They dated for 2 years. They married in June of 2003 in a church in the town where Carol had grown up, with her whole extended family in attendance and Daniel's parents sitting in the second row looking quietly pleased. Carol Whitfield had grown up in Harlan, Ohio, a town small enough that everyone knew your name and large enough that you could not always choose what they knew about you. Her mother had been a school teacher. Her father had managed a grain cooperative for most of his working life. She was the eldest of 4 children, and from an early age, she had functioned as the family's unofficial organizer, the one who made sure the younger ones had their homework done, the one who knew where the car keys were, the one who sat with her mother during a difficult stretch in the early 90s when the family's finances had contracted sharply and everyone else seemed to be looking at the ceiling and hoping things improved. Carol did not look at the ceiling. She made lists. She made plans. She moved through difficulty the way a river moves through a canyon, not by avoiding the rock, but by finding the path through it. She had studied health administration at Ohio State, graduated near the top of her class, and taken a position at a regional hospital in Columbus at 24. She was good at the work, exceptionally good, and she rose steadily through a series of administrative roles over the following decade. She was organized without being cold, authoritative without being abrasive, and she had an ability to manage people in crisis that her supervisors noted in nearly every performance review she ever received. She left the hospital in 2005, 2 years after marrying Daniel, to take a director position at a smaller medical group in Millbrook, which brought them closer to the small-town life that both of them, in different ways, had been moving toward. They bought the house on Crescent Lane in 2006. Their daughter Rachel was born in 2007. Their daughter Jenna was born in 2009. For most of the next decade, their life was what they had built it to be. It would be inaccurate to say their marriage was perfect. No marriage of 18 years is perfect, and the Hargroves were no exception. Daniel worked long hours in the years when the firm was growing, and Carol carried more of the domestic weight than either of them had originally intended. And there were periods, a stretch in 2012, another in 2015, when they were more like excellent roommates than partners in the full sense of the word. They had argued about money twice, and about parenting often, and about nothing at all on the kinds of evenings when the accumulated pressure of ordinary life looks for the nearest available target. But they had also built something real. They had built trust, the patient, accumulated kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the repeated choice to navigate difficulty together. And that trust, by 2018, was the deepest thing either of them owned, which is exactly what made what came next so destructive. The year before the accident, 2017, had been a difficult one for the Hargrove family in ways that were mostly invisible to the outside world. Daniel's firm had lost a significant contract to a competitor, and the financial pressure of that loss had put a strain on the partnership and, by extension, on Daniel, who had invested a significant portion of his personal savings in the firm's expansion 2 years earlier. He was not in financial ruin. They were far from that, but the cushion he had counted on was thinner than it had been. And he felt it the way a man feels, a change in the structural integrity of something he has spent years building. He slept less. He came home later. He was present in the house without always being present in the room. And Carol, who noticed everything, noticed this and worried about it, and did not always know how to reach him across the particular distance that stress builds between two people who love each other but are both carrying more than they have room for. It was also in 2017 that a name from Carol's past resurfaced, a name she had not spoken aloud to Daniel or to anyone in many years. His name was Owen Calder. She had known him before she knew Daniel, known him well, in the way you know someone when you are young and not yet certain about the difference between intensity and permanence. The relationship had ended badly, in the way that certain relationships end when one person wants something the other cannot offer. And the ending had left a residue that Carol had quietly carried and never fully put down. She had not told Daniel about Owen in any meaningful detail, not because she was hiding him, exactly, but because the past he represented was one she had moved definitively away from, and she saw no reason to import it into the life she had built. When Owen reached out to her in the spring of 2017, she did not tell Daniel about that either. That decision made quickly, without much reflection. The way you wave off a thing you believe you can manage would turn out to be the most consequential choice she had ever made. Owen Calder, by 2017, was not the man Carol had known in her 20s. He had moved through a series of jobs in the freight and logistics industry, working primarily for mid-sized distribution companies in the Midwest, and he had a reputation known to certain people in that industry, invisible to those outside it as someone who could solve problems that formal channels could not address. He arranged things. He moved things. He made connections between people who needed something done and people who could do it. He was not a criminal in the way a jury could easily demonstrate, but he operated in the margins of legitimate business in ways that served people whose interests did not always align with the law. When he contacted Carol in the spring of 2017, he was not reaching out to reconnect. He was reaching out because he had been asked to, and because he believed correctly, as it turned out that Carol was a door he could open. The man who had sent Owen to Carol was named Brent Seeley. Brent Seeley had been Daniel's business partner for 6 years, before a dispute over a municipal construction contract in 2016 had ended the partnership acrimoniously. According to Daniel's account, Seeley had misrepresented the terms of the bid, cutting Daniel out of a commission that represented a substantial sum. According to Seeley, Daniel had gone around him to the client directly, undercutting the arrangement they had agreed to. The dispute had been settled through a mediator, in Daniel's favor, and Seeley had left the firm carrying a grievance that the mediator's decision had not resolved. Some men absorb a professional loss and redirect their energy. Brent Seeley was not that kind of man. He had been building towards something for the better part of 2 years by the time Owen Calder showed up on Carol Hargrove's phone. The night of the 22nd of March, 2018 was a Thursday. It was the kind of early spring evening that Ohio does in that particular way, still cold, but with a softness in the air that made you think the cold was temporary, made you roll down the window a couple of inches even though you didn't quite need to. Daniel had been on a job site in a town called Fairview, about 35 miles south of Millbrook, doing a walkthrough on a drainage infrastructure project that the county had contracted his firm to oversee. He had left the site at 7:15 in the evening. He had texted Carol to say he was heading home and that he had stopped for gas and would be back by 8:30. She had texted back that there was dinner in the oven. He had driven north on Route 9 the same way he always did, through the flat farmland that opened up on both sides of the road in the dark, the kind of road where your headlights seem to reach further than they should because there is nothing to interrupt them. The accident happened at mile marker 31 at approximately 7:52 in the evening. A commercial truck traveling south on Route 9 crossed the center line at a long curve in the road and struck Daniel's car on the driver's side. The impact was severe. Daniel's car was pushed off the road and came to rest against a drainage embankment in a field off the eastern shoulder. The truck driver, a man named Gary Pruitt, was uninjured. He called 911 from the roadside. He told the dispatcher that he had drifted, that he had been awake since 4 that morning and had lost focus for a moment on the curve. The first responders arrived within 12 minutes. They found Daniel unconscious, with internal bleeding, 2 broken ribs, and preliminary signs of significant kidney trauma. He was airlifted to a trauma center in Columbus. The drive that should have taken 45 minutes took 1 phone call and 1 helicopter, and the kind of night that a family never entirely recovers from. The police investigation was brief by the standards of any reasonable scrutiny. Gary Pruitt submitted to a breathalyzer at the scene he was sober. His logbook showed a legal driving window, though it was at the outer edge. The truck was inspected mechanically sound. The road itself showed no signage failures, no unusual conditions. The investigating officer filed the incident as a fatigue driving accident, a category that accounted for a significant portion of the truck-related crashes on Ohio rural routes each year. Pruitt's employer, a company called Meridian Distribution Services, based in Louisville, cooperated fully with the investigation, producing records and logs without resistance. There was, on the surface, nothing to question. Tired driver, long route, unlucky curve. The kind of accident that prosecutors do not find worth pursuing beyond a traffic citation, and the kind that insurance companies settle without extended negotiation. What the investigation did not examine, because investigations follow the shape of what they believe they are looking at, was why Gary Pruitt was on Route 9 at all that evening. Pruitt's logged route for that day ran from Louisville North to a distribution center in Toledo. Route 9 was not on that path. It was a deviation of roughly 40 miles from the most direct route, a detour that added time to a drive that Pruitt was already logging at the outer edge of his legal hours. When Daniel's private investigator pulled this thread 4.5 years later, the answer she found was not in Pruitt's paperwork, it was in the internal communications of Meridian Distribution Services, a company that had dissolved its operations 18 months after the accident, and whose digital records had been partially recovered through a data forensics firm. What those records showed was a routing instruction, a single internal memo directing Pruitt to take a specific path through Fairview County on the evening of March 22nd. The memo was unsigned. The instruction had no stated reason. But we are getting ahead of the story. In the days and weeks following the crash, none of that was known or suspected. What was known was that Daniel Hargrove was in a hospital bed in Columbus, heavily sedated, with both kidneys failing. His older daughter Rachel flew in from Pittsburgh the morning after the accident. His younger daughter Jenna, who was in her final semester of college in Cincinnati, drove through the night and arrived before dawn. His brother Frank drove up from Columbus and sat with Carol in the family waiting area for 3 days straight, the two of them trading off trips to the cafeteria and saying very little that was not directly related to Daniel's condition. Carol did not leave the hospital for the first 6 days. She slept in the chair beside Daniel's bed when he was finally moved out of the ICU. She ate what the nurses brought her. She answered the phone calls from friends and neighbors with the same measured calm she brought to everything, telling them what the doctors had said, thanking them for their concern, and returning to the room. The kidney damage was permanent. That determination came at the end of the second week, when the medical team concluded that neither kidney had recovered sufficient function to sustain Daniel's life without intervention. He was placed on the transplant waiting list. He was started on hemodialysis, 3 sessions a week, 4 hours each session, the treatment that would keep him alive while they waited for a donor match. The waiting list for a cadaveric kidney transplant in Ohio ran, on average, between 3 and 5 years at that time. Daniel was 50 years old, otherwise healthy, a reasonable candidate. But 3 to 5 years is a long time to run on a machine, and the toll of dialysis on the body accumulates quietly and consistently. And Daniel, who had always been physically capable and self-sufficient, found the dependence on the process, the scheduling of his life around a clinic, the exhaustion afterward, the slow erosion of the physical confidence he had always carried without thinking about it harder than he had expected. Carol watched all of this. She watched it with the careful attention she brought to everything, and she processed it the way she processed everything privately, analytically, and with a focus not on what she was feeling, but on what she could do. She had herself tested for compatibility within the first month of Daniel's diagnosis. She did not tell him. She did not want to raise the possibility until she knew whether it was possible. Because she was not interested in hope as an abstraction, she was interested in hope as a structural fact. The results came back in the 6th week. She was a compatible donor. The match was not perfect, but it was strong enough to proceed. She called the transplant coordinator on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 6 months after the crash, from her car in the parking lot of the medical practice where she worked, and she asked what the next steps were. She was told there was a thorough evaluation process, physical, psychological, logistical. She said that was fine. She said she was ready to begin. She told Daniel on a Tuesday morning in April of the following year, 2.5 weeks before the scheduled surgery date, not as a question, as information. She had handled everything. She had attended the evaluation appointments around her work schedule. She had arranged for coverage at the practice during her recovery period. She had spoken to Rachel and Jenna separately and told them what she was doing and asked for their support and received it. Though Jenna had cried on the phone for a long time, and Rachel had asked approximately 30 questions in rapid succession, which Carol answered one at a time. When she told Daniel, she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee cup between her hands, and she said, "I have been tested and I am a match, and the surgery is scheduled, and I need you to not argue with me about this because I have thought it through more carefully than you are going to in the next 20 minutes. Daniel looked at her for a long time, and then he said, I know you have. And that was very nearly all they said about it. The surgery took place on a Thursday in late April. They were in adjacent operating suites, a logistical arrangement that Carol had confirmed 3 times with the scheduling coordinator because she wanted to be as close to him as possible during the procedure. The surgery lasted just under 6 hours. Carol's recovery was harder than anticipated. A post-operative complication kept her in the hospital for 8 days rather than the planned 5. Daniel, whose body accepted the new kidney with a speed that the transplant team described as encouraging, was recovered enough to visit her room on the 4th day, shuffling down the hallway in his gown with a nurse on one side, and he sat beside her bed and held her hand without saying much. And she told him she was fine, and he told her he knew, and they both understood that the words they were not saying were the most important ones in the room. The town of Millbrook threw a small benefit dinner for the family 3 weeks after they both came home. Carol thanked everyone and said it was all quite unnecessary and brought her famous potato salad anyway. What nobody in that room knew what Daniel would not know for more than 4 years was that Carol Hargrove had spent the evening before her surgery sitting in the dark at the kitchen table, not sleeping, going over something in her mind that she would carry alone for the rest of the time this story covers. She had done something. She had not done it maliciously, she had not done it freely, but she had done it. And Daniel was alive because of the kidney. And whether those 2 facts were connected or separate, or simply the same story told from 2 different angles, was the question that had been eating her from the inside ever since. The envelope had arrived at Daniel's office on a Friday. His assistant had left it on his desk with the rest of the week's mail, a plain manila envelope, standard size, his name typed on the front label, no return address, postmarked from a town in Indiana he did not recognize. He had looked at it for 30 seconds and then put it in his bag without opening it and driven home, and it had sat in his bag through the weekend while he mowed the lawn and watched football with Frank on Saturday afternoon and had Sunday dinner with Carol and Jenna, who had driven up with her husband and their 8-month-old daughter. He had held his granddaughter for an hour after dinner while Carol and Jenna washed the dishes and talked in the kitchen, and he had listened to the sound of his wife's laughter from across the room. And the envelope had been in his bag on the chair by the door the entire time, and he had not mentioned it. He did not open it at home. He did not fully understand why. Some instinct, the same instinct that makes an engineer walk the perimeter of a building before entering it, told him that opening it in the house, in the rooms he and Carol shared, would change something about those rooms in a way that might be permanent. So he had waited. He had gone to work on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and the envelope had traveled back and forth in his bag each day. And on Thursday afternoon, he had driven to the hardware store at 9 in the evening on the pretext of needing weather stripping for the garage door, which was partially true, and he had sat in the parking lot and opened it. He was not the kind of man who made decisions based on feeling, but feelings, it turned out, sometimes made decisions for him. After he opened the envelope, Daniel did not go home. He sat in the parking lot for another hour, running the photograph through his phone's search function, trying to identify the diner in the background. He found it the Whitmore Grill on State Route 40 inches Westfield County on the 4th search. He then searched the name written on the back of the photograph, Owen Calder. The search returned a LinkedIn profile that had not been updated in 3 years, a few references in industry publications related to freight and logistics, and a brief mention in a county court database from 2014, a civil dispute that had been dismissed. Nothing alarming on its face. But then Daniel searched Owen Calder alongside Meridian Distribution Services, and the connection appeared in a trade publication from 2017, a brief mention of Calder in an article about regional freight network restructuring, listing him as a logistics coordinator contracted by Meridian. Meridian, the company that employed Gary Pruitt, the man who crossed the center line. He did not sleep that night. He lay beside Carol in their bed in the dark, and she breathed slowly and steadily beside him, and he stared at the ceiling and made a list in his mind of every possible innocent explanation for what he had found, the way a structural engineer looks for every reason a thing might not be failing before concluding that it is. The photograph was dated 3 weeks before the crash. It showed Carol with a man who had worked for the company whose driver had hit him. Those were the facts. The innocent explanations, chance, coincidence, a connection Carol didn't know existed, a photograph sent by someone with a misguided or malicious agenda were structurally possible. But he had spent 22 years evaluating structures, and he knew the difference between a thing that held and a thing that was being held together by the effort of not looking at it directly. He called his brother Frank the next morning from his car before driving to work. Frank was 2 years older than Daniel, a high school football coach in Columbus who had always been the more emotionally fluent of the two brothers, the one who could say the hard thing without the conversation ending. Daniel told him about the envelope. He told him about the photograph, the name, the connection to Meridian. He told Frank he had not said anything to Carol yet. Frank was quiet for a moment, the way Frank was quiet when he was suppressing his first reaction in favor of his second. Then he said, "Before you do anything else, you need someone who knows how to find information, not you. Someone who does this professionally. And you need to know what you're actually dealing with before you walk into a conversation with your wife that you cannot walk back out of." Daniel said he knew. Frank said he had a name. The name was a woman in Columbus who had spent 12 years doing insurance fraud investigation before going independent. Her name was Sandra Cole, and she was very good at finding the things people had worked to bury. Sandra Cole called Daniel back within 2 hours of receiving his message. She had a voice like she had heard everything twice already and found none of it particularly surprising. He told her what he had. She told him to send her copies of everything and not to touch anything else until she called him again. Then she said, "One thing before we start, Mr. Hargrove. Sometimes people hire me to find the truth, and the truth is what I find. I don't shape it, and I don't soften it. If you want me to look, you need to be prepared for what looking finds." Daniel said he understood. He was not certain that he did. Sandra Cole took 3 weeks. In that time, Daniel went to work every day and came home every evening and sat across the dinner table from Carol and talked about the grandchild and the weather and the crack forming in the driveway that needed to be sealed before winter. And Carol poured them both coffee after dinner, and they watched the news together the way they always had. And the distance between who he was presenting himself to be and what he was carrying in his chest was the longest 3 weeks of Daniel Hargrove's adult life. He was not a man who performed normalcy easily. He valued directness. He valued the kind of honesty that had characterized his marriage, or that he believed had characterized it. And the performance of it now felt like a violation of something he had built and depended on. But Frank had counseled patience, and Sandra had counseled silence. And he was trying to hold both of those instructions while his marriage sat across the table from him and poured his coffee. Sandra Cole's first significant finding was not about Owen Calder. It was about an insurance policy. A life insurance policy taken out by Carol Hargrove 6 months before the crash on Route 9, with a payout of $400,000 in the event of Daniel's accidental death. Daniel had not known about it. He had not signed it. Carol had taken it out independently, which was legally permissible given the policy structure. When Sandra delivered this information, Daniel felt something drop in his chest. Because the obvious reading of that fact, wife secretly purchases large accidental death policy months before husband's near-fatal accident was damning in the way that obvious readings often are. It looked like financial motive. It looked like premeditation. It looked like the kind of thing that appeared in the crime documentaries his daughters watched on streaming services late on weekend nights. But Sandra was thorough, and thorough meant she didn't stop at obvious. She pulled the full policy. She identified the beneficiary. And the beneficiary was not Carol Hargrove. The policy named both daughters Rachel and Jenna Hargrove as equal beneficiaries, with a provision that the funds be held in trust until each reached the age of 30. Carol was not listed as a beneficiary at all. When Sandra relayed this to Daniel, she said, "This doesn't tell us what she was thinking when she took it out, but it does tell us she wasn't planning to profit from it directly." Daniel sat with that for a long time. The policy wasn't evidence of greed. If anything, it was evidence that Carol had been afraid that something might happen to Daniel, and quietly, without telling him, had tried to make sure the girls were protected if it did, which meant she may have known that something was coming. Sandra's second significant finding did damage of a different kind. In the course of reviewing communications and financial records through channels she declined to specify in detail, she came across a set of emails between Daniel and a woman named Patricia Ng, a project manager at a competing firm. from the period between 2016 and early 2017. The emails were not explicit. They did not constitute a physical affair by any reasonable evidentiary standard, but they were intimate in the specific way that communications between two people become intimate when they are staying just inside a line they have both agreed not to cross personal, warm, extending beyond any professional necessity, the kind of correspondence that a spouse, reading it, would have every right to call a betrayal. Daniel had ended the correspondence in February of 2017. He had never told Carol. He had told himself it was nothing because it had not become physical, and he had believed that sufficiently to stop examining it. He had not considered whether Carol had found it on her own. Sandra put the question plainly. She said, "Is it possible that your wife knew about the emails with Patricia Ng?" Daniel said he didn't know. Sandra said, "Because if she did, it changes the picture. Not in a way that excuses anything, but in a way that explains a motivation that we currently don't have a clear account for." Daniel drove home that evening and looked at his wife across the dinner table and thought about a version of the preceding 5 years, in which Carol had carried the knowledge of those emails, had sat with them, had processed them alone, in the way she processed everything alone, and had made a decision that he was only now beginning to understand the shape of. He thought about the fact that she had still given him the kidney, that she had still sat beside his hospital bed, that she had still, whatever she had done or known or felt, placed her own body between him and death. He could not reconcile those two versions of the same woman. He was not sure they could be reconciled. Sandra's third finding brought Owen Calder into focus. She had been able to access, through the data forensics work she had commissioned, partial internal communications from Meridian Distribution Services prior to the company's dissolution. Within those communications, she found the unsigned routing memo directing Gary Pruitt onto Route 9 on the evening of March 22nd. She also found, in a separate set of records, a payment made from a shell company to a personal account, linked through a series of holding entities to Owen Calder, a payment made 10 days before the crash. The amount was $14,000. There was no invoice, no service description, no paper trail that would satisfy a prosecutor in isolation. But it was a thread. Sandra said, "This is the kind of thing that means something or means nothing depending on what else we find. Right now, it means we need to find Brent Seeley." That was the first time Daniel had heard that name in years. He felt the structure of things shifting beneath him. Brent Seeley. Daniel had not spoken that name, had barely thought it in more than 3 years. He had closed that chapter. He had won the mediation, absorbed the financial hit, and moved forward the way he moved forward from everything with deliberate focus and without looking back. He had not considered, in all the years since, that Brent Seeley might not have done the same. Segment 6. The twist in full revelation. 35-0, 50-0. Daniel confronted Carol on a Saturday evening in November, 3.5 weeks after he had opened the envelope in the parking lot. He had waited until Jenna's family had come and gone from their monthly visit, until the dishes were done and Hank had been fed and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a Saturday night in late autumn in a small Ohio town. He sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee cup and he told Carol, in a measured voice, that he had some things he needed to ask her and that he needed her to be completely honest with him. She looked at him for a moment, that careful, reading look she had, the one that had always told him she was processing faster than she was showing, and she said, "All right." He slid the photograph across the table. She looked at it. She did not look away, which he had not expected. And then she said, "Where did you get this?" He told her about the envelope. He told her about Sandra Cole. He told her what Sandra had found, the routing memo, the payment to Owen Calder's shell account, the insurance policy, and the emails, which he named without looking away from her face. Carol was quiet for a long time after he finished. She sat with her coffee cup between her hands, and she looked at the photograph on the table between them, and the kitchen clock ticked, and outside a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the dark. When she finally spoke, she did not deny the photograph. She did not challenge the findings. She said, "There are things that happen that I need to explain in the right order. Please don't make me do this without being able to finish. If you stop me in the middle, you will only have half the story, and the half you have will be the worst half." Daniel looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Go ahead." Owen Calder had contacted Carol in April of 2017. She had not reached out to him. He had found her through channels she did not ask about because she did not want to know the answer. He had told her that he was working on behalf of a client who had a significant grievance against Daniel, and that his client wanted to send a message not to harm Daniel permanently, but to damage him enough to demonstrate that the grievance was being taken seriously. He had told her that the message would be sent regardless of her cooperation. What her cooperation would determine was the timing, which was the only thing that could be managed. If she cooperated, confirmed Daniel's route on a specific evening, the incident would happen when Daniel was alone on a rural road, away from traffic, in a location where first responders could reach him quickly. If she did not cooperate, his client would arrange things on a different schedule, in circumstances that were harder to control. He presented this as a choice. She understood it as a threat. Carol had not told Daniel. She had not gone to the police. She told Daniel, at the kitchen table that November evening, that she had considered both options and had been unable to take either of them, and that her reasons for that failure were the part of the story she was least able to defend. She had feared that going to the police would expose the nature of Owen's threat, which included the disclosure of something from her past, a prior pregnancy she had given up for adoption at 19, a decision she had made in a different life and never spoken about, not to Daniel, not to her daughters, not to anyone. She had feared that the exposure of that secret would damage her marriage and her family in ways she could not control. And she had told herself in the way that people under pressure tell themselves things that are more comfortable than the truth, that Owen's assurance about the controlled location and the rapid response was a guarantee, when she knew, on some level, that it was not. She had confirmed Daniel's route on the evening of March 22nd. She had told Owen that Daniel would be driving north on Route 9 from the Fairview job site, that he would be alone, and that the road would be lightly traveled at that hour. She had told herself that what she was doing was damage control, that she was choosing the version of the event that gave Daniel the best chance. She had spent the rest of that day in a state of controlled terror, checking her phone every 15 minutes for word from Owen that the arrangement had changed, that his client had decided against it, that she had time to find another way. The call had never come. The accident had happened. And when her phone rang at 8:17 that evening, and the voice on the other end was a first responder asking if she was Daniel Hargrove's wife, she had understood, in a way that never fully left her, exactly what she had done. The kidney transplant. Daniel asked her directly sitting at the kitchen table, voice steady, eyes on hers, whether the transplant was connected to this. Whether the sacrifice of her kidney was related to the guilt. Carol looked at him for a long time. This was the question she had lived with for 4 years, the one she had turned over and examined from every angle in the small hours of the night when Daniel was asleep beside her. And she said yes and no, both. She said that the kidney was not only guilt, that her love for him was real, and her desire to save him was real, and that nothing about what she had felt in those operating suite rooms was false or performed or calculated. But she also said, I could not have lived with myself if I had let you die on that table knowing what I had done. So I don't know how to separate those two things, and I've stopped trying. They are both true. I gave you my kidney because I love you and because I owed you my life. I don't know if that is one reason or two. Brent Seeley. Daniel had asked Sandra Cole to find him, and Sandra had found him living in a mid-sized city in western Pennsylvania, running a small construction consultation business. He was 58 years old. He had never been charged with anything related to the accident because, until Sandra's investigation, there had been no investigation to charge anyone from what Sandra had built, the routing memo, the payment trail. The connection through Owen Calder was a circumstantial picture rather than a prosecutorial case. She had taken it to a contact at a regional investigative journalism organization, a woman who had been tracking freight-related incidents in the Midwest for 2 years and who recognized the Meridian name immediately. That journalist had been the thread that eventually pulled the rest of it into the light. Not through the police and not through the courts, at least not initially, but through the kind of documented public account that makes official institutions uncomfortable enough to act. Owen Calder, when approached by the journalist with the evidence Sandra had assembled, had made a calculation that people in his position sometimes make the calculation that cooperation now was better than exposure later. He agreed to speak. He did not agree to go on record under his own name, at first, but the journalist was patient and the evidence was substantial. And over the course of 4 conversations, he provided enough detail to corroborate the broad outline of what Sandra had already found. He confirmed that Brent Seeley had contracted him. He confirmed the routing instruction. He confirmed that the payment had been made. He declined to characterize what he believed Seeley's full intent had been, whether Seeley had wanted Daniel seriously hurt or only frightened, but he confirmed that the event had been arranged and that it had not been an accident. The journalist published a detailed investigative piece 7 months after Daniel opened the envelope in the parking lot. Brent Seeley was named. The story ran nationally. Daniel had asked Carol only one question at the end of their conversation at the kitchen table, after she had told him everything in the right order, the way she had asked him to let her do. He had waited until she finished. He had sat with it all, the confirmation of Daniel's route, the insurance policy, the prior pregnancy she had never told him about, the 4 years of silence that had looked from the outside exactly like an ordinary marriage. He had listened to all of it. And then he had asked her, "Did you know I might not survive?" And Carol had looked at him for a long time. The way she looked at things, she was not going to make simpler than they were. And she said, "I was told you would. I chose to believe it because I needed to. I have never stopped knowing that was a choice I made for myself and not for you." And then she said, "I prayed that you would survive. Every day until you woke up and every day after." He sat with that. He did not answer it. There wasn't an answer that fit. The legal process that followed the journalist's publication moved in the way legal processes often move slowly, unevenly, and with outcomes that satisfied no one completely. Brent Seeley was arrested in his home in Pennsylvania 4 months after the story ran, on charges of conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. His attorneys were experienced and well-funded, and they moved immediately to challenge the evidentiary basis of the charges, arguing that the circumstantial chains Sandra Cole and the journalist had assembled did not meet the threshold required for the conspiracy charge. They were partially right. The routing memo was unsigned. The payment trail, while suggestive, ran through enough intermediary entities to be deniable. Owen Calder's cooperation, conducted through a journalist rather than a prosecutor, created admissibility complications that Seeley's defense exploited efficiently. The conspiracy charge was reduced before trial to criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. Brent Seeley did not face the charge that Daniel believed he deserved. He was convicted on both reduced counts. The sentencing guidelines for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment in Pennsylvania, given Seeley's lack of prior criminal record and the age of the offense, produced a sentence that the presiding judge acknowledged, from the bench, did not fully reflect the seriousness of what had occurred. Seeley was sentenced to 22 months, of which he was required to serve 14 before becoming eligible for parole. He served 12. He was released on a Tuesday morning in early spring and drove himself home from the corrections facility in a car his daughter had parked in the lot. Daniel was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. He had sat through the trial all 8 days of it in a seat 3 rows behind the prosecution table, with Frank on one side and Rachel on the other, and he had listened to every word. And when the verdict came in, he had nodded once, the way he nodded when an assessment confirmed what he had already expected, and he had stood up and put on his jacket and walked out of the building into the cold February air. Owen Calder entered a formal cooperation agreement with the Stark County Prosecutor's Office 4 months before the trial. In exchange for his testimony against Seeley, which corroborated the documentary evidence and provided the jury with the human architecture of how the arrangement had been made, Calder received a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation. He testified for 2 days. He was a composed and detailed witness, which several jurors later described as both helpful and unsettling. The ease with which he narrated the arrangement of a serious crime without visible remorse was, one juror said in a post-trial interview, the most disturbing thing about the proceedings. He returned to a private life after the trial. His whereabouts after the probationary period ended are not part of the public record. Carol's legal exposure was the dimension of this story that the prosecutor's office examined most carefully and resolved most reluctantly. She had, by her own admission, provided information that had facilitated the arrangement of the crash. That was not nothing. The question was what it legally constituted, whether it reached the threshold of criminal conspiracy, criminal facilitation, or accessory liability. The prosecutor assigned to the case spent 6 weeks reviewing what Carol had told investigators and what Calder's testimony had established, and ultimately declined to file charges. The stated basis was insufficient evidence of specific intent. Carol had not intended serious bodily harm, had been operating under duress involving coercive threats, and had made repeated but unsuccessful efforts to have the arrangement called off. The decision was not unanimous within the prosecutor's office, and it was publicly criticized by at least one victims' rights advocacy organization. Whether it was the right call depends significantly on the legal framework you apply, and people who know this case well continue to disagree. Daniel had been told of the prosecutor's decision by the assistant prosecutor handling the case in a phone call on a Thursday afternoon. He had listened to the explanation. He had not argued with it. He had thanked the prosecutor for the call and set his phone down on the desk and sat in his office for a long time, looking at the plans spread across his drafting table. He did not feel what he expected to feel, which he had expected to be relief or anger or some combination that he could at least name. What he felt was something that did not have a clean label, a complicated settling, the way a structure settles after the stress load on it changes, not returning to what it was, but finding a new equilibrium that might hold. He went home that evening. He made dinner. He and Carol ate together at the kitchen table, which they had continued to do through all of this, because the alternative was not eating together, and neither of them had been ready to make that choice permanent. The marriage did not survive intact. That is the honest account of what happened, and this story owes you honesty more than comfort. Daniel and Carol separated in January of the year following the trial, not dramatically, not with lawyers and court filings, but in the quieter way that two people who have shared a life for nearly 2 decades separate when the trust that held the life together has been fundamentally altered. Daniel moved into a rented house 8 miles away. He took Hank. He and Carol spoke by phone regularly throughout the separation about the grandchildren, about the house, about practical matters, and the conversations were civil in a way that surprised both of their daughters, who had expected something raw. Rachel, their older daughter, struggled most visibly. She had been closest to Carol, had spent years telling the story of her mother's kidney donation as a defining example of what love looked like when it was real, and the revelation that the story was more complicated than that destabilized something in her understanding of her own family that took years to reform. Jenna's response was different, and in some ways more difficult to watch. Jenna did not pull away from Carol. Jenna, who had inherited her mother's capacity for compartmentalization and her father's precision, sat with her mother for a long weekend shortly after the trial ended and listened to everything Carol told her, the full account, the right order, all of it, and then she sat quietly for a while and said, "I understand why you couldn't tell him. I don't agree with it, but I understand it." Carol had wept at that, the first time she had visibly wept in front of anyone since the night the paramedic called. Jenna had held her mother for a long time. Then she had said, "You have to tell Rachel, not me. You." Carol had nodded. It had taken 3 more months. The conversation between Carol and Rachel happened on Rachel's back porch in Pittsburgh on a Sunday in April, and Rachel had not spoken to her mother for 6 weeks afterward. Then she had called, and they had begun, slowly and imperfectly, to find what was left of what they had been. Daniel returned to the house on Crescent Lane 14 months after he had left it, not as a declaration, not as a resolution, but as a tentative step towards something neither he nor Carol had a name for yet. They had been seeing a therapist separately at first, then together a woman in Columbus named Dr. Andrea Walsh, who was known for her work with couples navigating what she described as compound betrayals, situations where the breach of trust had multiple layers, where the grief was not clean, where the healing was not a return to something prior, but the construction of something new on ground that had been irrevocably altered. Dr. Walsh did not offer them a verdict on their marriage. She offered them a process. Daniel found the process useful in the way he found most processes useful, not because it resolved anything, but because it gave him a structure to work within. Carol found it necessary in a way she had not anticipated. She had spent so long managing things alone that having a framework for not managing alone was, she told Dr. Walsh, the strangest and most difficult thing she had ever tried to do. What Gary Pruitt knew, and when he knew it, was a question that the trial addressed only partially. He testified that he had been instructed by a dispatcher he could not name with certainty, a voice on a phone to take the Route 9 detour, and that the instruction had been framed as a scheduling adjustment related to a delivery confirmation he was not able to verify. He testified that he had been awake for an extended period and that he had been fatigued at the time of the crash. Whether he had known the crash was intended, whether he was a participant or a victim of circumstance himself, was a question the jury did not have to answer because Pruitt was not charged. He had pled no contest to a traffic citation 5 years earlier. The double jeopardy implications of reopening that were complicated. He lived, at the time of the trial, in a small town in southern Indiana, and he did not give interviews or public statements, and his life after the trial was his own. 2 years after the revelation, on a Saturday in September, Daniel and Carol attended their granddaughter's second birthday party at Jenna's house in Westerville. They arrived in separate cars. They sat at the same table. Carol had made the potato salad. Daniel had fixed the leg on Jenna's dining room chair that had been wobbling since spring. They did not perform happiness. They did not perform recovery. They sat in the backyard in the late afternoon sun and watched the 2-year-old demolish a birthday cake with the focused enthusiasm of someone for whom the world is still entirely manageable, and they were quiet together in the way that two people are quiet when they have been through something that used up most of the words. At some point in the afternoon, Jenna looked out through the kitchen window at the two of them sitting in the yard, and she said to her husband, standing beside her, "I don't know what that is, but it's something." He agreed that it was something. They left it at that. There was a question that Daniel Hargrove was asked by Dr. Walsh in one of their joint sessions about a year into the process. She asked him whether he believed that Carol loved him. He thought about it for a long time, which was not the kind of man he was. He was not usually the kind of man who paused before answering. And then he said, "I think she loved me the way people love things they have complicated feelings about, which is a kind of love. It's not the kind I thought we had. But I've spent a year trying to find an explanation that works better, and I haven't found one." Dr. Walsh asked if that was enough. Daniel said, "I don't know yet. I'll tell you when I know." He has not yet told her. The sessions continue. The driveway crack on Crescent Lane has been sealed. The house looks the same from the outside. Most things do. What this story asks of you, and I've been thinking about this since I first came across it, and I have not landed anywhere comfortable, is whether you can hold two contradictory things about the same person simultaneously, and whether the holding of them changes how you judge what that person did. Carol Hargrove made a choice, under pressure, that contributed to a serious harm to her husband. She then spent 4 years making a different choice every single day to stay beside him and to give him everything she had, including a piece of her own body. Those are not the same act. They are not cancellations of each other. They are two real things that exist in the same person, in the same marriage, in the same story. The question of what to do with that, of how to live alongside that kind of complexity in someone you love, is not a question this story answers. It is a question this story hands to you. And I think you should take it seriously, because it is a more common question than most of us would like to admit. The narrator's job, in a story like this one, is not to deliver a verdict. The legal system delivered one, partial and imperfect as it was. The families have been living inside their own verdicts, revising them as new information accumulates for years now. What the narrator can offer is this: the callback to the beginning. The man in the parking lot, in the dark, with the envelope in his hand. He could have put it back. He could have gone home and had dinner and watched television and lived the rest of his life with a woman who had, by any observable standard, saved it. Some people would have made that choice. It is not an irrational choice. It is the choice to live inside the story you have rather than the story underneath it. And there are reasonable arguments for that. Daniel was not built that way. He had spent his entire career finding the thing that was wrong with the structure before the structure failed, and he could not turn that off, even when turning it off might have been the more livable option. Whether that quality, the refusal to leave a load-bearing question unexamined as a virtue, or a wound, or simply who he is, Daniel Hargrove could not tell you. And I am not going to tell you either. Before we get to how all of this resolves, and I want you to stay with me, because the way this ends is not the way you might expect, let us take a moment. If you have been watching this story unfold and you have thoughts, I want to hear them. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already subscribed, please do hit that button now, because we release a new documentary every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Now, let us finish this story the right way. There is one more thing that belongs in this account, and it comes from a conversation that Daniel had with his daughter Rachel about a year after the trial, during one of the Sunday dinners that had resumed at Crescent Lane with the cautious regularity of a habit being rebuilt. Rachel had asked her father directly, the way Rachel asked things, which was the way Carol asked things, which Daniel had always found both exhausting and clarifying whether he was angry, not at Brent Seeley. At Carol, Daniel had looked at his dinner plate for a moment and then said, "I was angry for about 4 months and then the anger ran out." What was underneath it was sadder and harder to carry than the anger, but it was more honest. Rachel had asked what was underneath it. Daniel said, "Grief. For the version of the last 18 years that I thought I was living, which was real, but it wasn't the whole picture. And you can grieve a version of something without it meaning the whole thing was false. It took me a long time to figure that out." Rachel had nodded. She had not said anything for a while. Then she had picked up her fork and said, "Mom said almost the same thing about you." Daniel had looked at her, and then he had said, very quietly, "Good. I want to leave you with the question I've been carrying since I first began researching this story, because I think it is the question that matters most, and the one that is least resolved by the facts of the case. The question is this: is there a version of love that is large enough to contain both what Carol did and what she gave? Because what she gave was enormous, the physical sacrifice of a living organ, the patient presence through years of illness and recovery, the daily choice to show up for a marriage she was not certain she deserved to be in. And what she did was also real, the confirmation of a rout, the silence in the aftermath, the 4 years of carrying a secret that her husband had a right to know. Both of those are in the same woman. Both of them happened. The law weighed them against each other and arrived at its conclusion. The family weighed them against each other and arrived at several different conclusions that continue to shift. I am asking you to weigh them, and I am genuinely curious what you find. I want to know what you would have done in Daniel's position, in that parking lot, with the envelope in your hand. Would you have opened it? Would you have driven home first, slept on it, waited for a moment when you felt more ready? Or would you have done what part of me thinks I might have done, put it in the glove compartment, told yourself you would deal with it later, and never quite found the time? There is no wrong answer. There is only the answer that tells you something about yourself, about what you can live with and what you cannot, about the difference between the truth you need and the peace you choose. Drop your answer in the comments. I mean that I read every single one, and the conversations that happen in the comments section of this channel are some of the most thoughtful I have encountered anywhere. Let me know where you are watching from as well. This community spans every state in this country, and I am still amazed by that every time I look at it. And I want to ask you one more question before I let you go, the one that I think is the sharpest and the most uncomfortable and the most worth sitting with. Does the kidney change anything? Not legally, we have covered what it did and did not change legally. But morally, personally, in the way you judge the full picture of who Carol Hargrove is, if she had not donated the kidney, if she had simply carried the secret and said nothing and let Daniel live on dialysis for however many years it took to find a donor, would your judgment of her be the same or different? I am asking because I believe most people's answer is that it changes something. And I also believe that most people are not entirely comfortable with the fact that it does. We are not supposed to weigh guilt on a scale against sacrifice. And yet, the kidney is inside his body. It has been keeping him alive for years. That is not a metaphor. That is a structural fact. And Daniel Hargrove, a man who deals in structural facts, has been trying to figure out what to build on top of it ever since. If this story has stayed with you, and I believe it will, in the way that the stories about love and guilt and the gap between who we appear to be and who we actually are tend to stay with us, then I need you to come back next week. Because the story I am going to tell you next is one that I have been sitting on for 2 months, waiting until I had reported it thoroughly enough to do it justice. It is the story of a woman in a small town in the Pacific Northwest who made a decision in a single afternoon that fractured her family across 3 generations and 40 years. It is a story about inheritance, about silence, and about the way that certain choices do not stay in the moment they are made. They travel forward through time and land, without warning, on people who were not yet born when the choice was made. It is one of the most complete and devastating accounts I have come across in all the years I have been making these documentaries. I will see you there. If you are new to this channel, welcome. Subscribe. We make one of these every week, and we do not do anything quickly or carelessly. Every story on this channel has been researched and constructed with the attention it deserves, because the people whose lives these stories represent deserve nothing less. If you have been here for a while, thank you. The support of this community is the reason these stories get told the way they do. Hit the like button if this story moved you in any direction: agreement, disagreement, discomfort, reflection. All of those are valid responses to a story this complicated. And leave a comment. Tell me where you landed. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me where you are watching from, and I will read every single one.